In the concrete hush between midnight and morning, Rowan Pike pressed his palm to a cell wall and felt it hum like a throat trying not to speak. The hum traveled through the cinder block into his bones, and he knew it as a memory disguised as sound. The prison slept one floor up. The old transit tunnel slept one level down. Somewhere between, his life had left a sentence unfinished. He carried one thing the guards had missed. A page folded so thin it behaved like breath. It was not a confession. It was not even a plea. It was his letter that kept repeating inside him like a lighthouse pulse, an echoing wish that would not quit. He waited for the corridor light to buzz, counted the flickers to steady his pulse, and made a choice that no one could unmake, not even the dawn. The lock clicked, once, from the wrong side. Something shifted in the dark. Rowan had been the kind of person who kept books like anchors, numbers like tides, and promises like chains. Before the cell, the hum of fluorescent lights belonged to the Public Records Office, where he audited grants that were small enough to look harmless and large enough to turn cities. He lived alone above a bodega that smelled of oranges, and he walked home late with a pocket notebook where he wrote invisible lines about ordinary things. A woman washing a window in winter, salt crust on a pier, the clean ache of a timetable that matches the train. He almost never said what he thought. He wrote it down and folded it, as if the folding could slow time. Then the audit turned, and he turned with it. Money went where it should not. The files he flagged disappeared. People he had never met spoke his name with a flatness that sounded practiced. He did not run. He could not run. He made a copy of everything he knew and sent it to a reporter whose face he could not recall. Evidence traveled. So did consequences. He wore the bracelets of the van, the chain that bit his wrists, and watched the city smear into a gray ribbon that only tightened. In court, he tried to give the truth a spine, but the truth kept arriving late and out of breath. A bailiff called the hour. The gavel fell. The fluorescent lights were relocated from office to cell, but the hum stayed the same. In the county facility called Stonebridge, the days were square and could be stacked. Rowan learned the language of bolts and hinges, the way metal remembered every hand that had ever held it. He learned the smell of wet concrete, cold, sweet, metallic, and the way fog pressed against the bars like a tired animal. He kept the letter hidden inside the binding of a book about harbors, a book with maps that promised exits he could trace with a fingernail. The letter had been born the night before sentencing, in a kitchen where the refrigerator clicked like a metronome. He wrote it to the person he would never meet again, a person he could not name without breaking. He wrote about the chain, and the chain answered back. He wrote about the wish that would not stop echoing even if the door did. He made rules. Wake before light. Count to 100 while the hallway breathed. Listen to the guard's footsteps until they aligned with his pulse. Copy a memory into his mind like carbon paper. Never speak the word hope where the walls could hear it. He kept his life small. He kept his life quiet. But in his quiet, there was a line that would not fold smaller. On a Tuesday that arrived like a sliver, the library cart brought a wrong book. It was labeled with a catalog code that did not belong to Stonebridge. It wore the dust of a building that had been locked since winter. The cover said Transit Authority Annual Review, and the corners had been rubbed to velvet by other hands. Rowan opened it because opening was what he did, and inside he found a map that had once been red and was now the color of dried sunlight. The map whispered of a decommissioned tunnel under Stonebridge, a service passage used when the facility had been a train depot and prisoners were parcels that moved on rails. He traced the line with his nail and felt it click against something beneath the paper, a stiffness, a ridge, like a second page glued to the first. He peeled back the map's lower margin and found a slit. Inside, there was a strip of paper no wider than a vein. It looked like a receipt, but the ink was not a price. It was a sentence. "If the lights fail in B wing," it read, "count to 13 and listen for the fan." No signature, no date. A faint coffee ring made it human. The fan could have been any fan, yet the sentence crawled into his ear and sat there. The letter in his book seemed to warm. The chain on his wrist itched like an idea asking to be used. At evening count, B-wing flickered. It was nothing, a small seizure of light that the guards cursed and ignored. Rowan did not. He waited until the overhead hum broke and restarted and broke again, and he counted to 13 the way a drowning swimmer counts strokes. He heard nothing, and then he heard it. A wobbling breath below the floor. The kind of fan that had survived 3 owners and forgot what off meant. The sound appeared only in the silence between the lights, like truth between sentences. He felt the fan travel up the wall and into his bones, as if the building were an enormous throat trying to clear itself. He did not sleep. He waited for the hum to misstep again, and when it did, he folded the letter tighter, slid his palm against the cinder block where the vibration was strongest, and understood that the map, the fan, and the light were a sentence he could read only when the line broke. The next morning, the wrong book was gone. The library cart held dictionaries and devotionals and a deck of cards mystery solved by the end of page 2. But the sound remained. It stayed like guilt. It stayed like a vow. It stayed like his echoing wish. That afternoon, a trustee with keys like a rainstorm came to fix something in the corridor. He left the maintenance hatch unlatched for a breath longer than rules allowed. Rowan watched the hatch's hinge and watched the guard's attention swat elsewhere. And behind the hinge, he saw a ghost of a ladder painted the color of abandoned. He knew enough about buildings to know that ladders only exist to connect a decision to a consequence. He tucked the letter down the spine of his book and decided. The hum agreed. The hum had always agreed. Somewhere below, the fan kept trying not to die. Escape was a word that did not fit in Rowan's mouth. He wanted something smaller, something that might pass as maintenance. He did not want to flee. He wanted to finish the sentence that had been interrupted when the map was pasted and the tunnel sealed and the city looked the other way. He counted routines like beads. He learned the cleaning crew's song of buckets, the officer who overpoured coffee, the camera with a blind corner that blinked like a lazy eye. He made himself less visible by being exact. He did what the schedule did, and then, sometimes, he did what the schedule did not. At night, when fog gathered itself and pressed against the bars, he took the chain of memory and ran it through the days. The chain was not steel anymore. It was a line of choices that clicked together and refused to part. He thought of the letter hidden in the harbor book and felt its weight, light as lint and heavy as a promise. He repeated a phrase 3 times in his head the way his grandmother had taught him to remember. The letter, the chain, the echoing wish. He did not think of faces because faces were heavy. He thought of hands. He thought of his own hands in a room with bad light, moving across paper, trying to make the world choose integrity over gravity. He thought of the fan below the floor beating like a slowed heart. He found the maintenance hatch again on a Thursday when the hallway traffic changed direction for no reason he could name. The trustee with the rainstorm keys was elsewhere. The hatch was locked, but locks are arguments and arguments can be misunderstood. The screws were old brass, their slots stripped by 1,000 hands. He pressed his ear to the seam and heard air where wall should be. The fan's breath rose faintly, an old man's laugh in the next room. He walked away because walking away was also part of any plan that hopes to survive its first hour. In the yard, he stood in the wind and learned it the way a pianist learns scales. The wind flossed the fence. A gull dropped a shell and missed the stone. Somewhere past the highway, a foghorn practiced the long vowels of regret. He looked at the sky and understood that time was weather. It turned when it wanted. He told himself that if the lights of B-Wing failed 3 nights in a row at the same minute, he would take it as permission. He told himself that if the wrong book came back, he would take it as instruction. He told himself that if he dreamt of the tunnel and woke with the taste of rust in his mouth, he would take it as a sign. He dreamt of the tunnel and woke with paper on his tongue. He smiled because fear and joy are cousins that share a toothbrush. The next evening, when the quiet cracked, he whispered a sentence into the seam of the wall where no one could hear him but the building. If anyone was still listening, they would want to hear what happened next. The hum answered like an animal that had learned its name. He did not speak to an audience. He spoke to the air that knew every secret the concrete had ever eaten. The words landed in the dark and did not die. They stayed the way all necessary words stay, not loud, just impossible to forget. On the 5th night, the wrong book returned. The cart rattled, the trustee whistled, and there it was, Transit Authority, Annual Review, wearing its dust like a disguise that no longer convinced anyone. The map inside had been altered. A thumbprint of grease smudged the exact location of the maintenance hatch. Beneath the smudge, a pencil mark arrowed toward a symbol he had mistaken for decoration. The symbol looked like a square missing one side, an old blueprint mark for a removable panel. Rowan's breath sharpened. He pressed the binding and felt the hidden slit again, but this time there was no new strip, only the memory of one. Even so, the page felt thicker, heavier. He lifted the map gently and found, tucked beneath the coverboard, a second document so translucent it might have been a shed skin. It was a carbon transfer of an inspection log from 27 years ago, a signature that was not a signature, a scrawl. The log listed a fan replacement, a panel weld, a camera repositioned for a budgetary reason, and a line that made his pulse double. Tunnel access, sealed pending litigation. The date made his stomach drop. The sealing had happened the same week his first job began in the public records office, when he believed the numbers would always be enough. He tasted iron. The wish that echoed inside him was not random. It had been born the week the tunnel went dark. He studied the log for a name and found none. The only human trace was a stapled corner that had been torn and taped, then torn again. Tape leaves ghosts. He touched the edge and felt grit. The grit was not from Stonebridge. It smelled faintly of coal and old rain. The map did not promise safety. It promised coherence. A way to tie the chain of his choices to the chain of those who had turned the bolts and called it policy. He did not imagine open fields. He imagined a small, square room below the cells, a room with a fan that forgot how to stop, a room where the letter might finally be read by more than his own blood. He wanted to carry the letter into air that could remember it. He wanted to show the city the panel and the weld and the date, to lay them on a table under good light where even liars look like people trying their best. He set his plan on rails. Count the guards on. C-shift, 4. Learn their orbit. Coffee, gate, office, corridor. Learn the camera's blind minute. At 01:13 bows, the monitor lost a frame and regained it. A glitch that looked like a blink. Time his breath to the fan's falter. 13 counts. Compact the library pencil lead inside the stitching of his hem. Memorize the number of screws that held the panel and the angle at which a stripped slot agrees to move. Replace routine with performance and call it survival. He wrote the sequence on the inside of his teeth and practiced reading it without moving his lips. At lights out, the corridor wore the color of aquarium water. His heart measured itself against the fan. The hatch did not move. It watched him. The camera blinked its blind minute right on time. He placed the book in his shirt. He slid to the hatch. The screws resisted like old men around a table, telling him how things used to be. He told them a different story under his breath. A story about the letter that had waited too long, and the chain that had forgotten it was meant to hold something other than fear. The first screw turned, then the second. Then a pause while footsteps crossed the corridor and a radio scratched a sentence that did not know his name. The third screw sang itself loose like a bright lie, turning true. The fourth stuck as if it had taken an oath. He leaned his forehead against the metal and saw what the wrong book had been trying to show him all along. The panel was not a door. It was a mirror turned inward, a surface that reflected only darkness, because darkness was what it faced. He slid the pencil from his hem and wedged it into the stripped slot. The lead gave, crumbled to dust, and still the screw considered. He rotated 1 degree, then another, and the screw's oath cracked. The panel sobbed away from the frame. Behind it, cool air moved like an apology. He found the ladder, the rungs cold and furred with time. He pocketed the top screw because endings deserved to be marked. He slipped through the square and into a throat of damp night that smelled like all the winters he had not had time to notice. The fan's voice grew full. It did not welcome him. It recognized him. He moved downward until the concrete changed caliber and the sound of the prison above became the sound of weather. His feet met the old transit deck, and he realized 2 opposing truths at once. The tunnel was a way out. The tunnel was not for escape. It had been built to carry things from one kind of darkness to another. He stood in the dim and held the letter. The chain on his wrist did not bite. It warmed. He understood that the wish echoing inside him did not want daylight for him alone. It wanted it for the sentence itself, for the sealed panel with the wrong date, for the audit file that had been swallowed. He did not flee down the tunnel. He turned and climbed back to the hatch long enough to seat the panel, thread the first screw by hand, and leave the fourth on the floor like a missing tooth. The absence would speak louder than any scream. Returning was not retreat. Returning meant delivering the truth to a place that could not pretend not to hear it. He replaced the panel's short 1 screw, tucked the other in his waistband, and slid into the corridor's aquarium light just as a radio crackled his wing number. Count time. He moved with the men who moved, a body among bodies, the book flat against his ribs as if teaching him to breathe. The guard with the coffee eyes scanned faces like invoices. Rowan's face did what faces do when they have learned to pass. In his bunk, the world turned slow as fog. He placed the book under his pillow and imagined the tunnel singing itself beneath the prison like a buried river. He imagined the panel thinking about the missing screw and composing a confession in metal language. He imagined the letter unfolding on its own and learning to speak the names he could not. Morning brought a noise that did not belong boots that had learned hurry, a door that did not want to stop being opened. A maintenance crew rolled a cart that squeaked in a question. A camera hiccuped. In the corridor, a sign appeared on an easel. Electrical. The word did not say panic, but its stem carried it. The fan below them had stuttered at the wrong minute for the wrong person. The prison had heard its own heart. Rowan's decision had traveled. That was the point. That was also the price. He had crossed from patient witness to active participant, and there was no way back to smaller. He could not protect the part of him that loved routine. He could not keep the guards from reading fear in the way his hands arranged themselves. A cell search swept his bunk with the impersonal tenderness of storm surge. The Harbor book survived because it suggested boredom. The wrong book did not. It looked like intent. A hand lifted it. A face frowned at the dust. Pages were leafed, corners examined, the map glanced at and set aside. The inspection log escaped notice not because it was invisible, but because it was obvious. Obviousness is a disguise that never goes out of style. The panel hissed. A shout rose from the maintenance crew that had found a thing that should have been there and was not. The missing screw lay like a coin in a fountain no one wanted to wish at. The easel sign was updated to say, security. Hands found radios. Radios found higher radios. The building's throat closed around the word lockdown, and the walls leaned in as if needing to hear. Cells clanged. Time thickened. Rowan sat on the edge of his bunk with the letter in his palm, folded so thin that edges ceased to be edges. He could not run to the tunnel. He could not even stand in the hall. He could only breathe and decide how to make the wish inside him a public thing before it drowned. He looked at the book card against the far wall, at the wheeled gray box with its wobbling caster and the seam of its false bottom. He looked at the guard with the coffee, eyes whose hands trembled when the radio said words that wanted to be bigger than a shift. He understood the single usable truth left to him. He would have to turn his cell into a transit point. He would have to move the letter the way the trains had moved the unnameable, without calling it escape. He would have to make the chain serve a purpose beyond holding. The chain that had followed him from van to cuff to routine waited. He unclipped the cheap ID tag from his wrist chain and slid the folded paper into the plastic sleeve, careful not to crease the part that carried the date. He clipped it back with hands that pretended to be indifferent and let it hang where it had always hung, like a label. The letter was now a charm everyone had been trained not to see. Evening fell all at once, as if the sky had been corrected. The lockdown eased just enough to move bodies where bodies sleep. The maintenance crew packed tools, as if the tools were guilty. The easel sign vanished. The panel returned to its place with a new screw that did not match the others, bright and false as a tooth the mouth refuses. The fan below them kept breathing because history is stubborn. On the way past the library cart, Rowan stumbled with a grace that looked unplanned. His chain swung, the plastic tag clicked against the cart's metal lip, and the letter, now visible as a nothing, slid behind the wobbling caster and down into the false bottom seam. He did not look. Looking is a language more fluent than speech. He kept moving into night. He lay on his bunk and listened to the building rehearse being safe. In another wing, a man laughed like someone testing a door. Somewhere close, a cough tried to be a code. He closed his eyes and remembered the inspection log date and the day he had first learned the right order of numbers to open the office where he believed the world could be managed with an abacus and a backbone. He remembered the chain biting and then warming. He remembered the hum of fluorescent lights, always the same, wherever rules lived. He let the tunnel under him become ocean. In the morning, the cart did what carts do. It rolled. It visited intake for paperwork. It visited the admin office, where a clerk with a pencil behind an ear signed lines and did not read titles. It visited receiving, where a mail bag was filled with books bound for an archive where dust is a career. It visited the gate, where the guard with the coffee eyes scanned the gray box with a wand that measured metal and found none. The chain on Rowan's wrist felt lighter because part of it was elsewhere, pulling. The book in the gray box shifted. The wobbling caster knocked the plastic tag free. The tag landed inside a crate of forms. A clerk with a tired thumb pushed it deeper while stamping a date that was not today. The crate moved out of the building and into a van with a logo that said City Records. The van drove across a bridge that had learned the weight of such errands. Fog pressed against the windows. The letter did not make a sound. This, too, was part of the wish. To arrive unheard and then to be inescapably read. Back in B-Wing, 2 officers discussed whether the panel had ever had 4 matching screws. Their conversation made the wall tilt. A 3rd officer wrote up a report that would live in a folder with a stern tab. The fan breathed. The tunnel did what tunnels do. It remembered. Rowan waited until evening count and closed his eyes at the exact second the hum of the fluorescent lights stuttered. In the space that opened, he told himself the 3 phrases like prayer without a god. The letter, the chain, the echoing wish. He did not imagine heroics at an archive or a courthouse. He imagined a hand turning a page and feeling a ridge, a thumb lifting tape, a mind adding a date to a decision and discovering a crime. He imagined a reporter he might never meet photographing a screw that did not match, and a panel with weld marks like scars. He imagined a story made of numbers and breath, carried by air and law. He imagined the wish stopping its echo because it had finally become voice. He was not the point. The point was the sentence continuing past him. A week later, the fog came in early, and the corridor took on the color of held breath. Stonebridge performed itself as always. The guard with the coffee eyes looked tired in a way that meant the news was larger than the shift. A bulletin board acquired a clipping without a headline. Someone had cut away the letters and left only a photograph of a panel with a missing screw and a hand touching rust. The caption was not a caption. It was a case number. The photo felt like someone had finally opened a window and listened to what cold air sounds like when it becomes clean. No one spoke the change out loud. Buildings prefer their revelations quiet. That night, Rowan slept without rehearsing. He dreamed of a harbor where maps were not glued to boards, but folded and refolded by people who knew where they were. He dreamed of a chain that had learned to be a line that connected rather than contained. He dreamed of the letter laid flat on a table beneath a light so honest that dust looked like a galaxy. He dreamed of a voice reading his words not as confession, but as confirmation, and of hands turning back to the date on the inspection log and pressing a finger there, of someone realizing that the tunnel beneath Stonebridge was not a rumor, but a record. In the morning, a courier envelope slid under his door, not to be opened by him, but to be seen by him, and that was enough. The envelope wore an official stamp and a different kind of gravity. It was addressed to a name that was not his and should not have reached his floor. Somewhere between the mail room and the corridor, the route had been misread in a way that served the truth. He did not touch it. Touching would turn the accident into an action, and the action into a violation, and the violation into a reason to make something smaller again. He watched it lie there until the guard with the coffee eyes noticed it, frowned, and picked it up with hands that shook a little. The guard's gaze met his just long enough to say nothing and everything. That the hum sounded different today, that the city had turned its head toward the right noise, that the chain might finally be lighter than the wrist. In the afternoon, the library cart rolled, empty, the gray box gone. In the evening, the lights stuttered, but the fan below did not falter. It had been repaired, then tested, then recorded. A maintenance log would remember the new screw's size forever. The tunnel remained sealed to bodies but open to evidence, which travels in straighter lines. Rowan sat against the wall and felt the building breathe in a new key. He thought of the first time he had counted to 13 and heard the fan answer from beneath his feet. He thought of the moment he had chosen the panel rather than the dark sprint. He thought of how wishes echo when commanded to stay private, and how they stop echoing when given a room with a table and a light and a hand that writes down what makes sense. He did not know what the city would do. He did not know how many case files would wake to the sound of their own names. He did not know if the person he had written the letter to would ever see it, or know it, or trace the ridges with a thumb and feel both rust and relief. He knew only that the wish had traveled beyond the concrete and the fluorescent hum, beyond his pulse and the narrow yard, out into a weather big enough to change. He knew that the chain was no longer only a holding, it was also a path. At last count, the corridor's shadows aligned like sentences beginning to agree. A gull called from somewhere impossible. The fog pressed gently against the bars and did not ask to be let in. It waited to be named. Rowan touched the wall and felt it hum, not like a throat trying not to speak, but like a voice learning its shape in the open. The letter was wherever it needed to be. The chain was serving the weight it had always promised to carry, and the wish that had echoed until it wore grooves in his sleep went quiet, not because it died, but because it was finished. He lay down under the bright, tireless light and closed his eyes on a picture that would hold even when the day dissolved. A square room below the place where men are counted, a table that did not lie, a fan that breathed steady as law, and a pair of hands unfolding a page that had traveled alone through rooms that forgot to be kind. Above him, the fluorescent hum kept the hour. Inside him, the words rested where they belonged. He listened until listening became the only work left. In the end, the building exhaled and the night settled into an honest dark. Rowan Pike let the quiet take the last sharp edges. He did not need to speak. The city was speaking now, slowly in paperwork and sunlight. The echoing wish had become a saying said, once and then repeated, not because it had to bounce to be heard, but because it had been heard and now lived on the surface of things. The chain lay still. The letter lay open. The wish, at last, echoed only where echoes belong inside the heart, that made it and then eased like tide, leaving a line of salt that spelled the simplest truth he had ever carried, the prisoner's echoing wish.